Correct. Yeah. It's on, it's ready to go. Excuse me, if I could have your attention for a moment, please. Good morning and welcome to today's event. I just want to note that it will be on the record, so we will be live streaming this through CFR.org. Please take a moment to turn off your cell phones. And if you should in your seat have a translation device, the headset. If you will, we'd like to do a quick test to make sure that it's working properly for everybody. So in a moment, you'll hear the mission statement of the council being read. If you could go ahead and to turn it on, you just move the volume wheel to the left until the red light comes on. You can continue to rotate that wheel to raise the volume. And if Greg, go ahead.
The council.
And we'll have people around the rooms who can replace your headset if you don't hear through it.
The
Just let us
Council
know.
on Foreign Relations is an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, and publisher.
Please do
dedicated
note that
to being a
throughout the
resource
meeting,
for
it
its
will be
members,
simultaneous
government
translation,
officials,
so you will
business
be hearing
executives,
both Portuguese and
journalists,
English
educators
when
and
the Vice
students,
President speaks.
civic and
But again,
religious
we'll have
leaders,
devices around
and
the
other
room, so if you have
interested
any trouble with
citizens
it,
in order
let
to help
a
them
member of
better
our team
understand the
know.
world and the foreign
Otherwise,
policy
we'll get started
choices
shortly,
facing the
and
United States
thanks so
and other
much.
countries. Founded in 1921, CFR takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. CFR carries out its mission by maintaining a diverse membership, including special programs to promote interest and develop expertise in the next generation of foreign policy leaders, convening meetings at its headquarters in New York and in Washington, D.C., and other cities where senior government officials, members of Congress, global leaders, and prominent thinkers come together with CFR members to discuss and debate major international issues, supporting a studies program that fosters independent research, enabling CFR scholars to produce articles, reports, and books, and hold roundtables that analyze foreign policy issues and make concrete policy recommendations, publishing Foreign Affairs, the preeminent journal of international affairs and U.S. foreign policy, sponsoring independent task forces that produce reports with both findings and policy prescriptions on the most important policy topics, and providing up-to-date information and analysis about world events and American foreign policy on its website, cfr.org.
Once you walk on stage, it'll become unmuted.
Yeah, Joaquin, that's it, Joaquin. But do you know Antonio Benjamin on the Supreme Court?
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Foreign Affairs Live, Brazil Outlook. We have the extraordinary opportunity today to hear from Brazil's Vice President, Michel Temer,
o vice-presidente do Brasil,
in charge
Senhor Michel
of
Temer,
helping to run one of the world's most dynamic
que está
countries and
encarregado
economies,
de administrar,
is responsible for
juntamente com a presidente Dilma, dos maiores países
with a
do
number
mundo.
of crucial bilateral partners and helping to essentially oversee Brazil's continuing rise onto the world stage and in its
ele está
economic, social, and political
supervisionando
development. And
a entrada
we
do
are,
Brasil no estágio.
as all people have been watching the Brazilian
Cada vez
rise,
mais o Brasil
with interest and
está
admiration
aparecendo
and
como
respect,
uma potência
and
econômica.
are delighted to be able to hear about the country and its progress and its challenges from, as it were, the guys in charge. And without further ado, we're going to hear from Vice President Temer.
Sem mais, vamos escutar o vice-presidente Temer. First of all, I would like to congratulate everyone, particularly Mr. Rose and Dr. Mario Garneiro, who have invited us for this wonderful opportunity where I will be speaking in the name of Brazil for American and Brazilians who are here and who are interested in Brazil. I also thought that the topic that they have selected for me is very so I'm going to talk about the political and institutional situation of Brazil right now. To summarize what I'm going to say, first of all, I'm going to give a broad overview of Brazil since the First Republic, to tell that throughout the years, Brazil had never had political and institutional stability. But nowadays, we live under the Constitution of October 1958, when the Brazilian Republic was proclaimed. And I'll be very brief about this. Our first constitution was in 1891. Rui Barbosa participated in that constitution, and he admired the American system. So the Brazilian Constitution of 1891 was very democratic because Barbosa admired the American system. But despite that system, we lived until 1930 from crisis to crisis. And the most important reason was that the Constitution wasn't being followed. So in 1930, a new movement happened, and it was very authoritarian, and two constitutions were created. The one from 1934 was very short, until 1937. And in 1937, the constitution was changed and was very authoritarian in its law. From 1930 to 1945, we had crisis after crisis. And also the separation of powers wasn't being obeyed. The National Congress was closed, and the President of the Republic governed through the law decrees. We always believe that the absolutist system is something from the past, but throughout the history of Brazil, we have had so many times in which we had this absolutistic state until 1945, when the centralized government falls and a new constitution starts in 1946. This constitution was very democratic. But even though it was democratic, from 1946 to 1964, we had again one crisis after the other. Economical, institutional, all types of crises. mainly because the Constitution was not being observed. There was a huge gap between the formal constitution, which is the written constitution, and the actual constitution, what was really happening in the state. So after crisis, in 1964, on April 1st, we had again another very centralized system with the Institutional Act produced by the revolutionary forces that put in force again the Constitution of 1946 with the modifications that the Institutional Act brought. So the Constitution continued in force by means of a revolutionary act, which is. So I'm guiding you through a period of time that goes from the Constitution of 1947 until we come to a very authoritarian constitution that apparently it allowed the power to come from the people, but in reality this was not happening. So in 1968, we had Institutional Act number 5 that gave absolute powers, total powers to the President of the Republic. So all the powers were concentrated in the Federal Union, in the executive power, in the person of the President of the Republic. So to exemplify what I'm saying, the President could stop people from having their mandates, electoral mandates, and this was done time over time. So there was a huge gap between the written constitution and what was happening on daily life. So the hugest number of crises that we had, political crisis, was from 68 to 85, and there was terrible persecution against the people who challenged the government. So after this brief summary of the history, we come to 1987, when we had a National Constituent Assembly that produced one of the most democratic constitutions that the world knows. The Constitution of October 5, 1988 is a mix of the liberal state principles together with the social state. And now I'm going to talk about the political and institutional scenario that starts in April 5, 1988. The first stage of what we call liberal democracy. The principles of liberalism have been intensively applied in our country. So following the constitutional system that was approved. So we came out of the authoritarian system and got to a very liberal state. The Article number 5 of the Brazilian Constitution has more than 70 paragraphs that talk about individual liberties. Or, if you would prefer a political expression, human rights. And besides this, it also says that all the treaties that talk about human rights should be obliged in Brazil. So we have been enjoying this freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of association, a wide range of freedoms. And there is a very strong division between the functions of the state, which obeys the principle of the independence of the powers. But we also pay attention to the harmony among the powers, which is not the case, of course, of the United States, that doesn't have any problems with this, but other countries do. So people put an emphasis on the independence among the powers, but they forget the harmony among the powers, because there are 3 powers in the state. But the power from the state is only one. It's the power that emanates from the people. So one of the functions of the state is to create laws. Another is to judge and create laws. So I'm not going to explain further the principle of the separation of powers, but I would like to say that we have a harmony and independence among the powers in Brazil. And in the sequence, I'm going to explain this. Since we spent 10, 15 years putting into force the liberal principles, at a certain point, Brazil is still a poor country with lots of people under poverty. So people started thinking about how to put bread on the table, how we can be fed, how we can prosper, how our children can prosper, how my family can be inserted in the Brazilian society. And then we started applying the principles of social democracy based on the Constitution. So I would like to mention that this is not only an action of the government, but also a way of putting into force the Constitution. So the social principles are established in the Brazilian Constitution. This has generated actions of the government directed towards the least favored classes. And in the past 12 years, around 35 million people have left the extreme poverty. See, this would be people who used to live with $30 to $40 a month, and now they belong to what is called the C class, which is a lower middle class, but people who are starting to be able to buy TVs, to eat better, people who have been able to buy their first car or go abroad for the first time, also have their children attend schools. So 35 million people in the C class, which is an extraordinary social ascension. So these people have started to consume, and now the Brazilian industry and international companies have been able to produce more in order to meet the needs of the C class. So before, we had a very strict concept that used to define what a national company is. And this used to give them financial and benefits, opportunities to get loans from the government. But the government after 1988 decided to modify the concept of a company nationally owned in order to benefit companies that had investments from abroad but were operating in Brazil. So this opened up the Brazilian market for foreign companies. So we had an increase in investment, not only in companies that were in Brazil already, but new companies that decided to invest in Brazil. So I'm presenting a combination of the social and economical context based on the Constitution. So the right to property in the Brazilian Constitution is an individual right. In our Constitution, we have a chapter about entrepreneurship, private entrepreneurship, which is praised in the Brazilian Constitution, based on the fact that Brazil understands that very little can be done without the participation of entrepreneurship, Brazilian and foreign. This has been the topic theme of the governments that have come after 1988. It's interesting to go back to the history of the democratic and social principles. Our Constitution is very young. It is 25 years old. So now I've spoken about the liberal democracy, the social democracy, and now we are talking about the efficiency democracy. Because all these people who have ascended socially and now are at the lower middle class level, and before they couldn't ask for anything, they couldn't even dream. Now they have initiated a process of demands And I would like to say also that there has been ascension from the upper middle class to a higher level. So there is a huge percentage of Brazilians who have moved up from the B class to the A class and from the C class to the B class. And this is very important for the people who want to invest in Brazil. So the third part of this democracy, I'm calling it the efficiency democracy. So now we have lots of people who have been incorporated to the middle class, which is the class that is the most mobilized in any society. So this class has been asking for more efficiency in the social services and from the government. So I'm from São Paulo state, and I have noticed that many more people have cars now. And this is very, very good for the automotive industry. Brazil is the 4th country that sells more cars in the world. But the problem is the person that just bought a car takes 3 hours to arrive at his or her job. And then these people go to the airport and see that the services are not good. They enter on the subway and they are like sardines in a can. So these people demand better services. And this has created a movement on the streets that started last year. And the president of Brazil, Dilma, and I, we didn't get scared. We understand that this is the result of everything that we have done and is a consequence of the social ascension of the people. And the only reason why these movements are not so well regarded at the moment is because political parties entered and joined these movements and is starting with violence and demoralized a movement that was democratic and supported by the government because it's based on the liberal principles that the Brazilian Constitution follows. So this has made that the powers, particularly President Dilma, called all the governors of the Brazilian states and started to talk more about commuting, education, investments in health. Because we are convinced that these protests are a result of what we have done in the past. And now I'm saying here that we have to be efficient in our policies, efficient in the private and public policies. And it's interesting that we have been getting results. I have been participating in several inaugurations of international companies that are investing millions of reais in Brazil. And when I go to these events, I always say that we have to understand that the entrepreneurs want to have a return to their investment. Nobody invests to lose money. Everybody invests to earn money, to earn a profit.
Por causa desses últimos mês, 2 meses, que aparentemente o Brasil teria começado a perder pouco a confiança.
And because of the past 2 months, when some say that Brazil has lost the confidence of the international investors, this is not true. Only this past month, I have been to 3 inaugurations of international companies that are investing in Brazil. And they are investing now not to make money today, but in the future, because they believe in the Brazilian economy and government. So when I talk about appliances, I can say that lots of people in Brazil will continue to consume these goods, and people will continue to invest. To conclude, I'd like to say that we went through these stages of the Brazilian Constitution without any institutional trauma. So the crisis used to create new Brazilian government, which used to be very bad for investors, because they had no assurance that contracts would be observed, and they were unaware of the changes in the policies. But nowadays, after 1988, we had the impeachment, which has been in the Constitution since 1891. But we did had an impeachment after 1988. The VP took office, and then we had an election that elected a labor worker, and now we have a woman that governs Brazil. So nowadays, nobody thinks about an institutional crisis in Brazil. And sometimes the word crisis is used in not a discriminatory way. So we can have sometimes political crisis or economical problems, but not institutional crisis. An institutional crisis is the fall of the institutions, which we had several times in Brazil. But now we have stability and confidence about what's going to happen in the future. And now I'm saying this because this is what interests the people who invest, because the right that arises from the Constitution is created to set the rules of the game. So if I set up a company, I know the consequences, I know the rules. So when the constitutional rules are obeyed, the tendency is for institutional stability, and which is what we have in Brazil. I preach this on a generic basis, but this also goes to the private and individual states. Because since we have institutional stability, we can invest in Brazil without any problems.
Para dar pouco de credibilidade ao que eu estou dizendo, eu tenho dados aqui do nosso Ministério da Fazenda e Planejamento, reveladores que de 2003 a 2014,
I have
nós
data
tivemos a abertura
to
de
prove
mais 20
that from
milhões e 200 mil postos de
2003
trabalho.
to 2014,
220 milhões e 200 mil novos
we have
empregos.
opened
Ora,
220,000 new
é
jobs.
porque a indústria, o setor agropecuário, alguém está prosperando. Se não
So
prosperar,
if we
não
have
há
opened
abertura
these
de
jobs,
postos de trabalho.
it's
Então nós
because
temos este dado
the
muito
companies are
enaltecedor,
prospering.
do que nós estamos dizendo. Quanto àquilo que eu dizia da redução da pobreza, basta dar dado percentual aos senhores.
In terms of
Em
the reduction
1995,
of poverty,
In
In
1995,
1995, the percent
Hoje,
of poverty
o
in
percentual
Brazil
é de 16%.
was
Diminuindo
57%.
sensivelmente.
Nowadays,
Nesse
the
governo,
percentage
nós
is
pretendemos
16%.
chegar ao final dele com cerca de 8%.
But
e
we
quem sabe,
went
o próximo
to be
governo,
at
em limite
80%
desse,
at the
para que
end
o país
of
seja
this
país
government.
apenas de classe média
And
e
maybe,
não país
hopefully, in the
de
next
extrema
government,
pobreza.
we'll have a
Quando-
country that has
claro
all the
que
people at least in
eu
middle
vejo
class.
histórico. Muitas vezes eu dava aulas na Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo e começava a falar do movimento de 64 e olhava para os alunos e dizia, interessante, eles
So
eu nasci em
When I used to
64.
teach
E
at the
todos os
law
jovens
school in São Paulo,
esperam oportunidade
and
de
I
emprego.
talked about
É o que mais
the
esperam.
movement
E
in
acrescem enormemente as
1964,
oportunidades
I
no
used to
mercado
think,
de trabalho
well,
para os
these
jovens.
people
Basta
weren't
dizer,
even
em
born
2003,
at that time.
eram cerca de 36 milhões de pessoas, jovens que trabalhavam.
In
Hoje são
2003,
56 milhões e
we
500 mil
had
pessoas jovens que trabalham. Ou seja, as
30 million
oportunidades
people,
de trabalho
30 million young
crescendo
people working.
enormemente. Por que é que eu digo isso
Nowadays
mais uma
we
vez?
have 60
Para
million
revelar que há
young
investidores
people.
dispostos a investir
And I'm
no
saying
nosso
this
país.
to
Mesmo
show
o
that
desemprego em meio da extraordinária crise
investors are
internacional,
willing to
todos os
invest
senhores
in
e
Brazil
acompanharam.
regardless of the international crisis.
Nós vimos que o Brasil, por exemplo, a zona do euro, por exemplo, teve um desemprego médio de 12%.
We see that
Aqui nos Estados
the
Unidos,
Eurozone
crises, né? De uma
had a high
desenvolvimento extraordinário.
percentage of
O índice
unemployment.
foi 6,7%. No Brasil,
Here
foi
in the US it was 6.7%, in Brazil it was 4%. So regardless of the international crisis, we were able to continue to progress in Brazil.
Mas a ideia de consumo é uma ideia de incremento da produção. Para dizer, dar dado
And
só
our
da
production
classe C,
increased,
que é aquela classe média,
consumption has
baixa,
increased.
Saiu em 2002 de 66 milhões para 118 milhões.
Nowadays,
E das
we have
classes A e B, 2002 eram 13
108
milhões,
million people
agora são
in the
29 milhões.
C class from
E das
68
classes D
million.
e E, que são as mais pobres, eram 96 milhões em 2002, hoje 48 milhões.
Today
Todo
we
país,
have
prospera.
48
Nossa
million in
dívida
the D
líquida
and
em
E
2002
class,
era de
which is
60,4%
lower levels
em relação ao PIB.
than we had in
Hoje
the
é de
past.
33,4% do nosso produto interno bruto. Não é? Nós temos a sétima economia do mundo. Como
We
todos
have
vocês
the
sabem,
seventh economy in the world.
disputando com países poderosíssimos economicamente. Nós estamos
We
só
are
no tópico. Quando eu vou mencionar aqui
close to.
um programa que é o Minha Casa Minha Vida, né?
I would like to mention a program that we have in Brazil, which is My House, My Life,
Como o campo da construção civil está aberto e como é
which
amplo no
shows
nosso país.
how the
Até
construction
dezembro de
field
2013,
is open
foram
in
entregues
Brazil.
1.510.000 novas residências para estas classes que ascenderam socialmente.
So,
e a meta até 2014,
We have delivered 1,500,000 new houses for these people who have ascended socially.
Portanto, campo abertíssimo
So we
para
have
a construção
a big
civil. Mas eu quero dizer
open
mais aos
field
senhores
for construction.
em palavras finais.
My final words,
Nós queremos muito investimento estrangeiro no nosso
We
país.
really want to
especialmente
have a lot of
investimento
foreign
americano,
investment in Brazil,
que tem uma
particularly
larguíssima,
the
fortíssima
American
tradição,
investment,
no Brasil.
because
E para isso,
American
nós
investment
começamos, por exemplo,
has a
com
tradition
a história da
in
infraestrutura.
Brazil.
Nós ainda temos uma infraestrutura insuficiente. E eu vou me
We
permitir
still
dar
have
alguns dados.
an infrastructure that is not efficient.
Mas eu dou aos senhores um grande programa de concessões na área, na infraestrutura,
We
para
have been
revelar as oportunidades que os
offering
países
concessions
têm. Isso não será feito apenas por empresas nacionais, por
to
empresas
show
nacionais
that
coligadas
these
com
benefits in
empresas
infrastructure
estrangeiras. Primeiro ponto.
will be made
Segundo
not
ponto,
only
eu já
by
adianto o
Brazilian
seguinte,
companies but
quando
also
esta
by
infraestrutura
international
estiver
companies.
toda organizada,
So when we finally have all
o país
this
estará crescendo de uma tal
infrastructure
maneira
in place,
que viabilizará
the
muito mais
country
amplamente os
will be
investimentos
growing
no nosso país. Eu dou
at
alguns
such a
exemplos.
pace
No
that
programa
will
de rodovias, por
make
exemplo,
viable
nós vamos
many
ter
more investments in Brazil.
9 novas rodovias federais,
We will
com uma
have
extensão de 7.500 quilômetros.
9
No programa de
highways being
portos,
built.
você sabe que os portos são públicos no Brasil.
The
mas
Brazilian
hoje, e aqui
harbors
vai
in Brazil
uma
nowadays
afirmação para revelar
are,
o apreço
are
que temos
public,
pela
belong to the
iniciativa privada.
government,
Os portos agora podem ser privados.
but
Essa nova
the
lei dos
harbors
portos no nosso
ports
país autoriza
are
o
being
setor
privatized
terreno lá,
now.
que é o terminal, se preencher certas condições, o porto é dele. Portanto, nós
So-
estamos ampliando o espectro para a iniciativa
So we are
privada.
widening
Nós
the
temos
opportunities
investimento no
for
programa de portos
private
em 15
enterprises.
estados. Estamos concedendo os portos públicos e vejam que as concessões é
We are,
mais
we
um
are
tópico
giving
de quem,
concessions
estando no poder público, quer a participação
in
da
15
iniciativa privada.
states.
Estamos concedendo os portos públicos, autorizando, portanto, também, por outro lado, como disse, os chamados portos privados.
We are authorizing
No
now
caso da
private
mobilidade urbana, eu
harbors.
mencionei isso na minha fala,
In the
nós
case
temos
of
a aceleração
of
do programa de
commuting
mobilidade urbana.
in
Nós
the
temos
big
investimentos no
cities,
metrô de São Paulo, investimentos
we
em várias
have
cidades.
investments
Tudo está
in the
aberto
São
à
Paulo
iniciativa
subway system
privada, no programa
and
de
in
ferrovias.
all
São
other
10
cities.
ferrovias com extensão de 12.000 quilômetros.
We have
Portanto, toda esta
railroads.
infraestrutura está
We are
planejada
also
para 5
investing
ou
in
6 anos,
10
7 anos.
railroads. The
Então, tudo isso
investments
aberto
will
à iniciativa privada,
be made
de
during
um
a
lado,
period
e
of
de outro
time
lado,
from 5 to 6
revelando,
years.
que será fundamental esta organização infraestrutural para
So,
também autorizar os
The
investimentos
infrastructure
nacionais e
organization
estrangeiros no nosso país para
is
que eles
essential
possam, prosperar. No programa de
to
aeroportos,
allow
os senhores sabem que nós
foreign
concedemos
investment
o aeroporto do Galeão,
to
no
grow
Rio de
in
Janeiro,
Brazil.
o aeroporto de Guarulhos, e o
We
aeroporto
are
de Brasília,
investing
e agora,
in
nós
airports
fizemos ontem, o aeroporto de Confins em Belo
in
Horizonte.
São Paulo,
E
Brasília,
restando apenas para ser
Rio, and
concedido
Belo
o
Horizonte.
aeroporto de Viracopos. Além do que,
And
nos
these
aeroportos estão sendo
airports have
feitas
been
obras que estão envolvendo
given to
bilhões
private
de reais,
initi-
em torno de 130
entrepreneurs.
bilhões de reais nos nossos aeroportos. Portanto,
8 billion
no
reais
caso
are
do
being
petróleo, vocês
invested
sabem que
in
nós
airports.
encontramos campos especiais, no chamado pré-sal, que vão quase
In terms
autorizar
of
que o Brasil
oil,
seja
Brazil
independente
has
em matéria de
found
consumo de
oil
gás e de
beneath
óleo.
the salt
Então, nós
layer,
temos, eu estou dando esses dados
and Brazil will be almost self-sufficient in terms of oil
da minha
in the
palestra,
near
mas
future.
para revelar exatamente isso, que nós não ficamos apenas na teoria. Ficasse eu
So,
apenas na
I'm
primeira
presenting
parte da
these
minha fala,
figures
eu estaria ficando num
to
plano exclusivamente
to
teórico.
prove that
Aqui,
we
nós
are
vamos
not
para a prática, para a
only in
execução,
the theory,
e não é sem razão
but we are
que hoje
also
ainda,
doing these
eu lia-
initiatives in a practical
eu
way.
lia nos jornais do Brasil
So today I read in the
uma-
Brazilian newspapers
instituto, americano
that an American institute
que o Brasil é o primeiro,
says
especialmente entre os
that
BRICS,
Brazil
é o primeiro
is number one,
em
particularly
matéria
among
de
the BRIC,
progresso social.
is the
E uma
first
afirmação que
in
o
terms
Lutz
of social
afirma que não vai
progress.
reduzir nota com perspectiva do Brasil este ano ou em 2015.
And
Portanto,
they say
gerando ainda
that
a
Brazil
confiança
will keep the
no nosso
same
país. Em
ranking
palavras finais, eu quero mais uma
this
vez
year and next year.
agradecer a oportunidade que tive de poder
So
fazer
I would
esse
like
serviço
to
histórico
thank
aos
you
senhores.
for the opportunity to
Eu
give you
falo
this brief
como
history.
advogado. Eu me lembro que como advogado eu me convenci
I'm an
quando eu
attorney.
convencia da causa do cliente.
And I remember that when I I believed in the client's
Mas
cause.
quando eu me convencia dos argumentos, eu falava com muito entusiasmo.
I was very
peticionava com muito entusiasmo,
enthusiastic
não é?
in
Eu
my
espero
defense.
que eu
So
tenha feito o papel de quem
I hope
acredita no meu país e quem
here
acredita no governo,
I have
e, portanto, eu
played
tenha
the
falado
role
com
of
entusiasmo
someone who
do
believes
advogado
in
que
my
acredita
country,
no seu direito.
and I have spoken with the enthusiasm of the attorney who believes in the client.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for that very thorough review of the situation in Brazil. So many questions, so little time, especially because we'd love to get as many as possible of our guests and participants to take part. But let me just ask a couple of questions. You talked about international investors. It's possible that we have a few of them here in the room today. And one of the questions that that community has been grappling with is the question of why Brazil has had such a hard time sustaining high growth rates. So I'd love to get your thought on that and on what it will take to get Brazilian growth back up to a strong level.
Elevada de crescimento. E o que vai ser preciso fazer para fazer com que o Brasil volte a ter essa taxa?
Olha, eu acho que,
I think
em primeiro lugar, o Brasil sofreu, evidentemente, os efeitos da crise internacional. 2008 e 2009.
Brazil has suffered the effects of the international
Nós
crisis.
tivemos, assim como
In
vários
2009,
países do mundo,
Brazil,
PIB
in the same
negativo.
way as
Mas
other
veja, neste último
countries,
ano, o nosso
has had
índice
an
foi de
internal product
2,9
negative.
do PIB.
But
Nós
our
perdemos
index
para quem?
last year was
Para a China,
2.9.
talvez para a
We lost to
Indonésia, para a Arábia
China,
Saudita.
maybe Indonesia, Saudi
Mas creio que em
Arabia.
relação aos países europeus,
But I believe that
e
compared to
mesmo,
European
quem sabe
countries,
mesmo em relação aos
and
Estados
perhaps
Unidos,
even the
nós estamos
US,
numa boa posição.
we are in
não
a
é?
good position.
Não vamos ignorar que, face à globalização, o Brasil seja um país
We
inteiramente
cannot
apartado
pretend
do
that
que acontece no mundo. O que
Brazil
acontece
is
no mundo.
apart from the
Até
rest
porque
of the
o
world.
Brasil,
What
mas devo
happens
dizer,
in other
em
countries
ao
impacts
longo
Brazil.
desse tempo, o Brasil fez o possível
But
para
I'd like to say that throughout the
incentivar
time,
a indústria brasileira.
Brazil
Você sabe que
has
foram inúmeras as desonerações tributárias
given incentives to Brazilian
intensas em todos os
companies,
setores da economia
and
nacional.
we
Havia uma queixa
decreased
lá
taxes
dos
for-
valores da chamada folha de pagamento trabalhista. Nós
because
desoneramos
there
a folha de pagamento.
there were lots of
Portanto, nós
complaints
estamos, fazendo
about
o possível
labor
para
costs
sair de qualquer,
for the
dificuldade.
companies.
Mas
So we are
eu
trying to
concluo
do
dizendo
as much as
que
we
as nossas
can to
dificuldades
get
não
out
são
of the
diferentes
difficulties,
das
but
dificuldades
I'd
que os
like to
outros
say
países,
that our
estão,
difficulties are the
vivendo.
same as
E
the
a nossa
difficulties that
perspectiva
other
para
countries
isso
have.
é de muito desenvolvimento
But
ao longo
we
desses
are
próximos anos.
developing a lot, and we are going to develop even more.
It may be self-serving, but Washington tends to see itself as acting on behalf not just of its own interests, but that of a broader global liberal order. And so Washington sees itself not so much in American foreign policy, not so much as a hegemonic action, but as promoting and sponsoring a global order that allows other countries to rise up within it. Brazil has risen and has grown and has flexed its muscles. And some in Washington wonder whether it wants to participate more in that US-sponsored order or somehow overturn it or challenge it. And I'm curious how you see Brazil's ambitions on the global stage.
Brasil no cenário internacional.
Olha, sabe que o Brasil tem participado deste fenômeno que o senhor aponta, né? Que no fundo é um fenômeno globalizante, ou seja,
Brazil has participated in this phenomenon that is a global phenomenon. Brazil doesn't look only at itself. Brazil looks at other countries. Brazil belongs to several international organizations. One of them is the BRICS, which is not established by law, but it's an association of countries that work together, not only for their own interests, but to reach global development. So in Brazil, we have a constitutional act that says that Brazil will do as much as possible to establish a Latin American organization. And Brazil participates in several organizations in Latin America in order to increase the opportunities in these countries. And among the BRICS, Brazil is one that has the most progress and development. And the Brazilians' participation in these organizations in Latin America is to help the other countries. And our relationship with the U.S. is historic and traditional. And to prove this, you can see all the companies that are established in Brazil. It's difficult for a Brazilian company to establish in Brazil, in the U.S. But we have a very good relationship with Washington, and we intend to continue with this. The United States, in the beginning of the Brazilian history, it was England, but nowadays it's U.S. And I have taken part in 2 events in London with Mr. Cameron, the Prime Minister, about safety in eating issues. And Brazil co-presided the events in London because we have this history of trying to progress in the social level.
Excellent. Well, at this point, I want to invite participants to join our conversation. So a reminder that this meeting is on the record. Let's wait for the microphone, speak into it, and we'll get a couple of concise questions in, I think. So yes, over there, and then we'll also bundle it with one over here, too.
Bom dia, senor. My name is Tanisha Tingle-Smith. I'm an independent Brazil watcher and a member of the CFR Brazil Task Force. Brazil remains a country of interesting paradoxes. At the same time this week, Brazil was notably lauding the strides the country has made in the transition to democratization since the dawn of the military regime 50 years ago. There were also rather stark reports about the increasing militarization of many communities in Rio under the aegis of the pacification program. To what extent is the government engaging civil society groups and other interested parties to ensure the human rights and the protection of social welfare in Brazil's most vulnerable cities? Thank you. Muito obrigada.
And let's also get one here.
Well, it's very good that you remember this aspect. The militarization in the state of Rio de Janeiro is not an intervention from the armed forces in the institutional level. It's help that the armed forces have been providing to the police in Rio, because the safety issue and drug traffic are a very important problem in Rio. So in Rio, the drug traffickers were making the life of everyone in Rio very difficult, and also the rest of the country. So
as chamadas unidades pacificadoras,
In-
policiais pacificadores.
In Rio, we have created the UPPs, which is units of the police that are aimed at pacifying the communities, and these are police that is trained not to be violent, but to integrate the people from the community in the Brazilian society. However, the violence of the drug traffic sometimes is so strong that from time to time the armed forces have to intervene. So I'm going to give you an example. The armed forces will participate in the World Cup in Rio in order to ensure the safety of the people. And I would like to invite everyone to go to the World Cup.
As secretarias de segurança pública do Estado,
So
a
the
Polícia
local
Federal e as Forças Armadas. Nós temos
the
esse
local
dever,
police
nós podemos,
forces,
deixar que
together
isso é
with
muita
the armed
dificuldade
forces,
para quem queira ir,
are
para o Brasil.
joined
Então,
to
intervenção
help make
episódica.
people
No mais,
safe in
a
Brazil.
senhora sabe que nós temos
So
uma
these
liberdade,
interventions
as Forças
have been
Armadas hoje,
sporadic.
Elas se comportam de uma maneira
The armed forces in Brazil behave in a very discreet way, sometimes too discreet, in order not to interfere with the state. And I would like to use the opportunity to talk about religious freedom in Brazil, to say that we are the champions in religious freedom in the world. We are number one. And I wrote an article about this, and I got millions of people talking to me about this in the social networks.
Thank you. So let's go here for the next question.
Sidney Nakarodo, professor da Universidade de Colômbia. Senhor vice-presidente, o senhor mencionou durante o seu discurso a importância do papel do setor privado, dos investidores. Minha pergunta está relacionada ao rebaixamento do Brasil, há 2 semanas. E se, primeiro, o governo foi surpreendido com a notícia, e segundo, se essa notícia fez o governo brasileiro rever algumas das suas prioridades para a política macroeconômica.
To review as policies based on its ranking. First of all, the lower ranking was not given for the investments. And today, Moody's has told us that is not going to give us a lower grade. And if you ask me if Brazil is concerned about this, of course, the Brazilian government knows and has confidence in what it's doing, but of course it serves as an alert. In the same way as the movement in June made us become alert and guided us to make more investments in infrastructure. So I would like to say again that the lowest ranking did not reduce the investments in Brazil, but we take it as an alert. The lower grade was minimum.
It's always a tradition of the council that we end on time, but since we started a little bit late, I'm going to let it run for another 5 minutes. So we've got a couple more questions in. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Good morning, Vice President. Thank you for your exceptional remarks. My name is Earl Carr. I had a question. Many economists, as well as interest groups, in particular the National Confederation of Industry, ICI, argue that the government is not doing enough to control the inflation rate in Brazil. The Brazilian Central Bank last week announced that they were increasing the inflation forecast from 5.6% to 6.1%. In your opinion, is the Brazilian government doing enough to control inflation, particularly as you look at how to help the social middle class increase?
crescimento da classe média. Yes, the government is doing the possible and the impossible. Our goal is 6.5%, and this goal hasn't been changed. Last year, we were under the impression, particularly me, last year around June. Oh my God, in December, we'll have huge inflation. But last year, we sticked to our goal. And this year, the same thing is happening. But I'm going to assure you, we are going to continue with the same goal. 6.4% is our goal, but the average in the past few years has been 5.4. So we had to increase the interest rate in order to control inflation. Inflation is like tomatoes. Like last year, tomatoes increased their price a lot, so people said, oh, inflation is going to rise. So this year, people are having the same idea because tomatoes increased their price. But I can assure you that this is not going to happen. And the government is working to make sure that this doesn't happen. So we didn't like to increase the interest rate, but we did increase it in order to keep inflation under control.
Last question over here.
Última pergunta.
Hello, and I'm Julia Zweig with the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Vice President, thank you for being here with us. Last year, President Dilma and President Obama used the word postponement to describe their decision, or the decision, for the President of Brazil not to come to Washington for the state visit last October. Can you talk a little bit about how the bilateral relationship might go in the future, independently of whether the president is able to be reelected? Could you speak a little bit about and potentially return to Washington for the state visit? What do you foresee the relationship looking like over the next 2 to 5 years in terms of the partnerships and the strategic dialogues and those wonderful words that have been used to describe its trajectory over the last 10 years? Thank you.
So you are referring to an episode that happened last year when the president was supposed to come to the U.S. last year, but she couldn't come, and she said she postponed because of the spy scandal. But this topic has been treated through the diplomatic channels, and I think we are going to have a meeting very soon with President Dilma and President Obama. And they have been meeting each other in several international events, and they have been talking about the Snowden scandal, but this is going to be overcome very soon, because the relationships between Brazil and Brazil cannot afford a rupture. We will have a deeper partnership with the U.S., and my presence here is also an indication that the Brazilian government is very comfortable with the relationship between Brazil and the U.S.
And that's a wonderful note on which to end, Mr. Vice President.
Isso é uma
Thank you
ótima
very, very
maneira
much.
de terminar.
We're with you
Muito
in
obrigado.
spirit, if not in presence, in June, and for years and decades to come, and welcome an ongoing relationship. Obrigado.